Have you ever, like, really stopped to think about, I don't know, how your brain just works?
Mm,
I mean, just the fact that you can recognize your friend's face in a crowd or remember some weird fact from, like, forever ago?
yeah,
It's pretty wild when you think
it
about it.
is. It is wild.
And then on top of that, how scientists are using computers to understand all of that stuff.
Yeah, using computers to try to understand brains.
It's really fascinating.
Absolutely. Like by looking at the brain through computation and cognitive science, it's giving us like crazy new insights into all the fundamental processes
Yeah.
about how we even perceive the world, how we learn, and how we remember, you know?
Yeah.
It's almost like having this whole new set of tools to explore, what's going on inside.
Yeah. And that's exactly what we're doing in this deep dive today.
Right.
We're going to be looking at the Computational Cognition Lab at Lawrence Technological University.
Okay.
And we're going to be exploring some of the really cool research themes that they're investigating there, which basically gives us a glimpse into like the cutting edge of how people are using computational methods to unlock all the mysteries of our minds.
Yeah, exactly.
So this is kind of a guided tour through some like really fascinating cognitive science.
It is. Like, we want to try to break down some of the key research areas that are being explored at the Computational Cognition Lab.
Yeah.
And, today we'll be looking at how we learn to categorize visual information and how they're using innovative digital tools to assess our memory.
Perfect. Okay, so let's jump into that first theme then.
Okay.
How we learn to categorize what we see. I mean, it just seems so automatic, right?
Yeah.
Like I know a square is a square and a circle is a circle,
Mm,
but what happens when things like aren't so obvious?
right, right. Imagine trying to sort apples from oranges, but some of the apples are kind of orangish and some of the oranges are rounder than usual.
Okay.
So that's kind of the complexity that they're getting at in this 2023 paper by Bohill and colleagues at this lab.
Hmm.
And they're really looking at how we learn to categorize this visual information.
Yeah.
And they really want to focus on whether we use different learning strategies based on if a category is based on like really clear rules versus when they overlap and we have to like integrate multiple pieces of information at the same time.
Okay, so like rule-based learning versus learning by like a more intuitive feel.
Exactly.
Okay, how do you actually study that in the lab?
So they designed this like really clever experiment, and they're using these visual stimuli called sinusoidal grading. So think of them kind of like blurry striped circles, and they can vary in like the blurriness and the angle of the stripes.
Okay.
And the participants had to learn to sort these into four categories: A, B, C, and D.
Okay, so like pretty abstract visual puzzles.
Yeah.
How were these categories actually set up?
So this is where it gets really interesting, right?
Okay.
Because they created two different ways to define these categories.
Hmm.
And one was rule-based, which we'll call RB. And in the setup, the boundaries between the categories were pretty clear.
Okay.
Like based on really clear-cut rules related to the fuzziness and angle of these gradings.
Yeah.
It's like sorting by like size first and then color. Very easy to define.
Okay, clear rules.
Yeah.
Got it.
What was the other way?
Yeah, what was the other way?
So the other one was called information integration, which we'll call 2.
Okay.
Now, these categories were designed to really overlap. So if you imagine like a graph with fuzziness on one side and angle on the other, the different categories, and these are represented by orange squares, green triangles, and open and closed shapes in their figure 1.
Okay.
They're plotted on this space.
Okay.
And the two categories, they were essentially like a 45-degree rotation of the RB categories, which kind of causes them to blend in the middle.
Mhm.
So you couldn't just look at one feature and like be certain which category it
Yeah.
belonged to.
So it wasn't like a simple checklist.
No,
Like
yeah.
you had to consider the fuzziness and the angle.
You got it.
Okay.
You had to consider both. And because of this overlap, even if someone learned perfectly, the highest accuracy they could achieve was around 97%.
Oh, wow.
Which forced the participants to like really integrate both of these pieces of information to make like the best possible classification.
Okay, so they learned these tricky categories, and then what happened?
So then they did this visual search task.
Right.
And after the participants had like several training sessions to learn these categories,
Yeah.
they did this search task and they were shown 4 of those grading stimuli at once,
Hmm.
one from each category. And their task was to quickly identify a target stimulus based on a cue.
So what kind of cue?
Yeah, so they used 2 types of cues,
Yep.
categorical and pictorial.
Okay.
So categorical cue was simply a letter, A, B, C, or D, telling them which category it belonged to.
Right.
And a pictorial cue was an actual image of the greeting stimulus that they were looking for.
Oh, okay, that makes sense. So what did the researchers find about how these different learning methods affected how they performed in the search?
Okay, so first off, both groups, so those who learn the rule-based categories and those who learn the information integration categories, both of them showed huge improvement in their accuracy at classifying the gradings over time as they were going through the training.
Yeah.
And that's shown in figure 3 of the paper.
Okay.
But interestingly, the 10 group, they actually started off with slightly higher accuracy, but by the end of training, that initial advantage was basically gone.
So both ways of learning got them to roughly the same level in the end.
Right.
But what about the different strategies that they developed?
So that is a really crucial insight from this study. And it really gets at how these different methods impact their performance. So table 2 in the paper details the different strategies that participants were using, and the rule-based learners were overwhelmingly relying on what they call independent decisions rules, meaning that they were likely looking for one or two specific features to decide which category a grading belonged to.
Right.
Whereas the information integration learners, they were mostly using dimensional integration strategies by the end of training.
Okay.
So they were considering both fuzziness and angle together, mixing ingredients in a recipe rather than focusing on each one separately.
Okay, so different routes to learning leading to different ways of making those classifications. How did this play out when they had to actually do the search?
So this is where the connection to the real world becomes clear.
Yeah.
So the categorical cues, the letter cues, participants who had the rule-based training were much more accurate in identifying the target, but those who had the information integration training were actually much faster at responding.
So accuracy favored the rule-based learners, but speed went to those who integrated the information.
Exactly.
That's interesting.
It's a fascinating trade-off, and it really highlights how the way we initially learn something can have a lasting impact on how we can use that knowledge in different situations.
Yeah.
And it potentially prioritizes whether you're going to be more accurate or faster.
Yeah.
And furthermore, they found that the learning strategy that participants developed during the initial training stuck with them, and it influenced how they performed in a later verification phase where they had to classify the stimuli again.
So what does this mean for me?
Yeah.
As I go about learning new things?
So think about it. When you're trying to grasp a new concept or learn a new skill, do you consciously try to break it down into a set of rules?
Yeah.
Or do you find yourself slowly developing a more complete understanding over time where you can't pinpoint every rule?
Right.
You just kind of get it.
Yeah.
This research suggests that our brains actually have different pathways for these two types of learning.
Mm-hmm.
And these pathways have different strengths depending on the task. Right. Think about a doctor who can diagnose a condition really quickly based on experience versus meticulously following a checklist.
Mm-hmm.
Different ways of doing the same thing.
Yeah, it makes you think about everything from learning an instrument to mastering a new software program.
Yeah.
Are we employing all these different learning styles and we don't even realize it?
Exactly. And understanding these different ways that our minds learn can inform how we approach education, training, and even our own personal learning habits.
Yeah, very cool. Okay, so we've looked into how this lab is investigating how we learn to see and categorize, but now I think we should probably move on to the next theme,
Okay, sounds good.
which is all about digital assessments of visuospatial working memory.
Yes. So our ability to temporarily hold and manipulate visual and spatial information is crucial for so many daily activities. From remembering where you parked your car to following directions, or even picturing a solution to a problem in your head.
Right.
And a standard way to actually assess this ability is through the Corsi block tapping task.
The Corsi, what was that?
Yeah.
The Corsi block tapping task.
Block tapping task.
It sounds very old school.
Yeah, it is.
What is it?
It's a really well-established neuropsychological test.
Okay.
And it involves a wooden board with 9 physical blocks, and they're all arranged on this board. And the examiner will tap a sequence of these blocks, and then the person being tested has to tap them back in the same order. And that's to assess their forward span.
Okay.
Or in reverse order for their backward span.
Yeah.
And then the length of the sequence increases until they can no longer accurately reproduce it.
Okay, I can see that.
Yeah.
But I know that this lab is all about the computers.
Right.
So where does technology come into play here?
So in this 2014 paper by Brunetti and colleagues, they introduce eCorsi, which is a digital tablet-based adaptation of this like classic Corsi task.
Okay.
And it has like so many advantages for research.
Like what makes a digital version better than the old blocks?
Well, for one, it's so much easier to use and administer.
Okay.
Like a tablet is much simpler to set up and transport than a physical board with like loose blocks.
Makes sense.
But more importantly, eCoursi allows for much more precise control over the timing of when the blocks light up on the screen.
Okay.
It can automatically record a bunch of data, including the memory span itself, which is the longest sequence someone can remember, but also their reaction times down to the millisecond.
Wow.
Plus, it's highly customizable, so researchers can easily change the number of blocks, the timing of the sequence, and even administer the test remotely.
Wait, remote memory testing?
Yeah.
That sounds like insanely useful
It is.
to reach like way more people.
Yeah, it has a ton of application.
So how is this eCoursi set up?
So the eCoursi setup involves a tablet displaying yellow squares on a black background. So it's mimicking the physical blocks.
Okay.
And this tablet is communicating wirelessly with a separate computer that runs the experiment software. And they use this communication protocol called UDP, OSC messaging.
Okay.
And that ensures that everything stays perfectly synchronized.
Okay.
And so the experimenter controls the sequence and records the data from the computer while the participant interacts directly with the tablet by tapping the on-screen squares.
Okay, so no concerns about like someone accidentally knocking over the blocks.
Exactly.
What kind of like memory tasks can you actually do with eCoursi?
So it has several different modes. There's the span sequence mode, which is most comparable to like the traditional task where the sequence length is gradually increased to find someone's maximum memory span.
Okay.
And it even includes standardized sequences that have been validated by other researchers, like the Kessel sequence. And then there's a free trial mode where you can set a specific sequence length and the software will randomly generate new sequences.
Oh, cool.
And finally, there's manual mode, which allows researchers to create their own, like, completely custom sequences for specific research questions.
That's really versatile.
It is.
Like to study all these different things.
Yeah, exactly. And they actually tested eCoursi with over 100 participants.
Okay.
And they used both forward span tasks, which is repeating the sequence in the same order, and backward span tasks, which is repeating in reverse, which tends to be harder.
Yeah.
They've even included super span forward trials,
Okay.
where they test memory for sequences that are longer than the individual's typical forward span, just to kind of see how they perform under pressure.
So how did the like results from the eCoursi compare to what we already know from like decades of research using the physical blocks?
Well, the encouraging thing is that the average memory span and the error rates observed with eCoursi were very, very similar to what's been reported in all these past studies. So that really strongly suggests that eCoursi is a valid and reliable digital alternative.
Okay.
And they also replicated some like well-known findings, like forward span being longer than backward span and younger adults generally having longer spans than older adults.
Yeah.
But interestingly, they also saw a trend for male participants to have slightly longer spans than females. So it's confirming the existing science, but with like a modern tool.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Were there any like brand new insights that this digital version allowed them to uncover?
Yeah, so because of the like precise timing capabilities, it allowed for some novel analyses.
Okay.
For example, they looked at the first tap latency, which is the time delay between the last block in the sequence lighting up and the participant's first tap.
Right.
So it's basically how long it takes them to start their recall.
Gotcha.
And they found that this latency was significantly faster in the forward recall condition compared to the backward recall condition. But surprisingly, they found that older adults actually had faster first tap latencies compared to younger adults, even though their overall memory span was shorter.
So older adults might be like quicker to start responding even if they can't hold as much in their memory.
Yeah.
That's interesting.
Yeah. They also observed that for those super challenging, like super span sequences that participants often got wrong, they tended to have a longer first tap latency, suggesting that they're like hesitating more and struggling more mentally before even trying to, reproduce the sequence.
So eCoursi isn't just a digital like replica. It's actually providing all this extra information.
Yeah.
the cognitive processes like the hesitation.
Right. It's giving us a lot more detail about how the brain is like actually working.
Right.
And as you mentioned, the potential for doing this research remotely is huge.
Yeah, that's really cool. It kind of emphasizes how technology is changing how we investigate, like the inner workings of our minds.
It is. And it's providing these really precise and flexible tools to understand like basic cognitive abilities.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so to bring it all together then, this deep dive has shown us how scientists are using these computational tools to understand how we learn, how we categorize, and how we hold information in our memories. And it's really interesting to see how they are all connected in this like quest to figure out how our cognition works.
Right. And it's super important to remember that there's this direct link between understanding these like basic processes
Yeah.
and the development of technologies that can both assess and potentially like support these processes.
Right.
And that has huge real world applications, from like designing better educational strategies
Yeah.
that actually cater to different learning styles to creating more like sensitive and accessible tools for assessments.
Definitely. So to leave you with a final thought here, I think we should consider, given what we've just talked about, the power of these computational approaches, what other aspects of our thinking, like our decision-making, our problem-solving, even our creativity, do we think can be understood through computer science?
That's a really good question. It seems like we're like just scratching the surface.
Yeah.
And I encourage you to like think about these things more and maybe even look at those original papers.
Yeah.
Like the journey of understanding the human mind is never ending and incredibly rewarding.